new series of Brass Tacks begins next Tuesday.
TV coverage can be controversial, and given its impact on public opinion, there are some people, politicians mostly, who argue that the BBC should hold back from exploring issues and should simply report on events as they occur. Brass Tacks will disappoint those people.
Brass Tacks will be asking what's right and wrong, for instance, about children who must care for their disabled parents, about the role of the church in politics, about people finding themselves in debt, unable to pay their bills, about the Japanese imposing their working methods on British industry, and about what's most needed if neighbourhoods are to survive in our city centres. But Brass Tacks will take its investigations a step further by inviting you to follow through issues in our studio. You will help us get down to Brass Tacks. That's every Tuesday evening on BBC Two. Join us then.
Brass Tacks begins next Tuesday at 8:30 on BBC Two. Newsnight in 35 minutes will be investigating the row over MI5 with a discussion on whether there should be an inquiry into their activities during the Harold Wilson government in the 1970s. Charles Wheeler will be talking about the latest in the Iran-Gate hearings, and there'll be a report from South Africa, which went to the polls today. Well, now on BBC Two, Duncan Campbell reports on the Association of Chief Police Officers, another secret society.
This is the annual meeting of one of Britain's smallest trade unions. It's only got 280 members, yet its influence on government policy has been profound. In trade union terms, this man's the shop steward's convener. He's head of the negotiating committee, and the man he negotiates with is a few rows behind. The trade union is the Association of Chief Police Officers, President James Anderton. The man at the back is the Home Secretary, Douglas Hurd. 2 years ago, Mr. Hurd's deputy at the Home Office summed up the relationship between the association and the government.
You, the chief constables, are not slow to tell us if we are getting it wrong, and that is as it should be.
But until the miners' strike in 1984, hardly anyone had ever heard of the association, ACPO for short. Even now, almost all its deliberations, decisions and documents are secret. Indeed, the full extent of ACPO's influence can only be traced with the help of detective skills, which ACPO members would, in different circumstances, take pride in. The charges against ACPO are that they, not the government, have decided national policy in most fields of law and order, that they're trying to set up a national police force by stealth, and that they are unnecessarily secretive and accountable to no one but themselves. So, how does ACPO plead?
We are accountable, I suppose, essentially to ourselves as a responsible body. If we make serious errors of judgment, then the whole world knows, and we are very quickly criticised, and have been from time to time, because usually there has been a lack of proper information about what we were seeking to do, and we may be partly at fault in that. I have a huge post bag, and the public in my area are not slow to criticise me and my officers if they think we haven't got it right.
You're happy that you're accountable?
Well, I'm certainly challenged, and I'm certainly prepared to answer to the people for what I do.
But can you really be accountable only to a daily post bag of complaints? For the moment, ACPO seems to be pleading guilty. So we set out to find if chief constables like ACPO President Jim Anderton were really prepared to answer to the people for what they and ACPO do. We started by asking for basic clues. What is ACPO? Who runs it? Every trade union must have a rule book, so we asked for a look at ACPO's.
I don't think any organisation necessarily makes its rules available to all and sundry. There's nothing secret about them as far as I'm concerned.
Is it a document you'd be prepared to make available to this programme?
Well, I wouldn't. I would have to make inquiries of my colleagues, but I don't think it's a document that I have the authority to make available to anybody.
A small clue on the charge of secrecy. So like any detective starting a big case, we needed a Chief Constable Supergrass to help us with our inquiries. And we did obtain a copy of the rule book. It's no bestseller, but it's a helpful glimpse under the association's veil of modesty. 43 Chief Constables are members of the ACPO Council. In Scotland, there's a brother organisation, ACPOS, or ACPO Scotland. The two work closely together. The rules make it clear that ACPO's ruling body, the 7-member executive committee, is virtually self-selecting. The committee themselves usually nominate the president and other members. There's 7 permanent council committees on topics of major importance, and many other special committees and working parties on issues of the day. Although the association has no statutory existence, it dominates a quasi-official body called the Central Conference of Chief Constables. That's where they meet senior Home Office civil servants twice a year. What's discussed at the conference is secret even from most ACPO members. And the conference fails to represent everyone with a legitimate claim to attend.
Well, I think the main criticism to make of that is that the police system of our country is supposed to be based on a tripartite arrangement, that is, local democracy, central democracy, and the professional chief constables. Now, the Central Conference only involves the senior representatives of the chief constables, not all the chief constables, and senior civil servants and other government representatives. There is no involvement of the third member of the partnership, which is local democracy.
Cavalry charges and riot squads are the ugly face of policing, one that most chief constables wouldn't want to see happen for real, any more than anybody else. Although hardly anybody knew it at the time, the battle at Orgreave, which saw some of the most violent scenes in the year-long miners' strike, also saw new policies from ACPO being tested for the first time. Rather later, however, the association's plan saw the full light of day. In complete secrecy, ACPO had issued members with a riot control manual laying down new and radical tactics for dealing with this kind of situation. In particular, the manual suggested special uses for shields and truncheons, uses which were at variance with official Home Office policy. But Home Office guidelines were put aside, and ACPO's suggestions prevailed. This is what local police standing orders, based on Home Office guidance, say about the use of truncheons for controlling a crowd.
The use of the truncheon is only to be resorted to in extreme cases when all other efforts to arrest have failed and a prisoner is likely to escape.
This is part of ACPO's interpretation, as seen at Orgreave in 1984.
Run at the crowd in pairs to disperse and or incapacitate. Disperse the crowd and incapacitate missile throwers and ringleaders by striking in a controlled manner with batons.
But since the existence of the manual was supposed to be secret at the time, even very senior police officers on the spot knew nothing about it.
Well, the riot training manual issued by ACPO is still something of a mystery because I've never met anybody who's seen all of it. And it was quite obvious at the time when it became publicised, I think which just before Orgreave during the miners' strike, that many senior officers hadn't seen it. There was the famous incident of the senior officer rebuking a group of men who were striking their shields with their truncheons. There was a lot of criticism of this practice in the press. 2 or 3 days later it was revealed that this is a tactic encouraged by the riot control manual to instill fear into the rioters.
Unfortunately for ACPO, when some of the people charged with rioting at Orgreave came to court a year later, police officers were forced to disclose the document from the witness box. Parts of the manual were then deposited in the House of Commons library.
It was and still is a most useful and helpful document. It offers us guidelines and helpful information upon how to deal with outbreaks of serious public disorder.
And dispersing and incapacitating is something that you regard as within the minimum use of force.
Yes, are we now talking about a subject of public disorder and riot, or are we discussing the role and function of the ACPO? Which is it?
We're discussing the words used in the riot control manual.
Well, I'm not here to discuss the words used in a confidential police document.
So ACPO pleads the suspect's right to silence. But did ACPO think of asking anybody else before suggesting that sort of tactic? The Home Office, the courts, and government law officers could all have had an important interest in the public interest.
Why should we consult people outside the police service when we're determining operational policies and tactics?
You happen to tell us it's been received from Leicestershire.
This National Reporting Centre was set up by ACPO at the very beginning of the strike. From the National Control Centre at Scotland Yard, units of every police force in England and Wales were being directed by a single commander, the ACPO president. ACPO called it mutual aid, but the critics said, now we have got a national police force. And when it came to intercepting pickets a long way from the pits they were trying to reach, different forces suddenly adopted the same novel tactics. ACPO certainly seemed to have put a new national policy into force.
The individual chief officers would say that that was their decision, that the Chief Constable of Kent decided that people would be stopped at the Dartford Tunnel. Chief Constable of Northamptonshire and Nottinghamshire decided that people would be stopped on the borders they're coming in. But it was a very similar policy pursued by most of the forces taking part.
There were no policy directives issued at all from the National Reporting Centre, which, as you know, is under the overall control or command, as it were, of the president of the ACPO at that particular moment of time.
If there weren't policy directives from ACPO, there certainly was an agreed policy. And what's more, a policy that was, quite simply, an attempt to reshape the existing law.
The difficult thing about that is that pragmatically it might have been the right decision. It would perhaps prevented a lot of disorder and dispute, but there was no law then that allowed the chief officers to do it.
Do you think those chief constables who did set up roadblocks so far afield and in so doing led the courts rather than followed them were acting outside the rule of law?
It is not for me to comment on the actions of individual chief constables.
You would wish to follow the courts yourself rather than lead them?
I don't see the point or relevance of that question in the context of a discussion about the role of the Association of Chief Police Officers.
So ACPO pleads the right to silence. After months at the centre of the news, police chiefs were well aware of the controversy that the National Reporting Centre had created. So they made a public display of dismantling the NRC when the strike was over. It'll never be put together again, at least not under that name. It's been retitled the Mutual Aid Coordination Centre. But its activities had shown the public how a national police force, or at least a national squad of riot police, would operate. That's the main evidence that suggests that ACPO could become the centre of a British national police force.
We may get one day. Whether it would be better than what we have at the present time is a moot question. If we had a national police force controlled wholly politically by whichever party was in power, then I don't think that would be a terribly good thing.
Continental military-style police once seemed very alien to Britain, but this is a British police exercise in Birmingham. Could this be how we'd experience the national police of a future Britain? It's certainly the kind of state police image that many people fear. But the evidence suggests that ACPO is definitely not the prototype for a national police force. Rather, it's the alternative, an alternative that chief constables prefer. Under the present system, ACPO helps chief constables get the best of both worlds, local autonomy and national influence, but without control or accountability, either local or central.
I don't think the vast majority of chief constables would want a national police force, because I think there is an awareness that a national police force would lead to a greater control of chief officers of police. I mean, they haven't had to put up with a bureaucracy which is higher in the pecking order than themselves.
But riot control is only one of a large number of sensitive areas of policing policy on which ACPO has developed and maintained a clear corporate position. They include the use of computers, special branch operations, public order, and police intelligence systems. In these matters, the association's views have usually prevailed. 2 years ago, as a new public order bill was being debated in Parliament, ACPO moved to a unique new phase of political activity, direct lobbying in the House of Commons.
Well, it was so important an issue, it was so fundamental to the whole future of policing in this country that we had to, yes, take a somewhat extraordinary step in making sure that right up to the last minute the views of the police service, and especially chief constables, was made known.
The ACPO lobby was effective in getting what they wanted from the public order bill, and in not getting what they didn't want, such as a power to arrest for offences of racial harassment. That was left out. ACPO members have indeed learned how to use political muscle. In his memoirs, former Metropolitan Commissioner Sir Robert Mark boasted how he and ACPO had taken on the government and won. The government had wanted to reform picketing laws, but ACPO didn't like the plan. So from their Scotland Yard offices, ACPO telex to every chief constable, urging them to protest. The success of ACPO in killing that bill was only one example of the chief constable's lobby in action.
Oh yes, I mean, from time to time, the ACPO office, at the behest of the President, would send out telex messages to all chief constables, advising them of, say, the ACPO policy or the ACPO line, and asking them not to go against it.
So there would be an ACPO party line?
Yes, there would be an ACPO party line, which was usually thrashed out at the Chief Constable's Council meeting.
Police Constable Brian Jones is the familiar face of the police. No flame-proof suits, no riot shields, no truncheon battling. A friendly face on the streets, a face you can talk to, who'll tell you the time of day or the way to the bus stop.
Go down here, you'll see the television shop, DER. If you turn left at DER...
But coppers like Brian have another job to do, a job that isn't necessarily obvious in situations like this. He's expected not just to use his eyes and ears for anything going on round him, but to feed it all back into central files, acting as the front line of an intelligence system, a system designed by, guess who?
Criminal intelligence is material which is collected virtually on all and sundry. It's not information or intelligence dealing with terrorists or subversives. It's information which is picked up by local community policemen, area constables, your friendly Bobby, about the everyday lives of very ordinary people. Police constables are told in Lothian and Borders, for example, and many other forces throughout the country, to have an informant on every street, somebody, according to force orders, who is curious enough to find out about other people living down their road and pass that information on to the police.
That means not just watching for crime, but assiduously gathering information about people and events and indexing it away. About 12 years ago, ACPO set up a special committee to develop police local intelligence systems. Now, in documents describing the tasks and duties of a community constable, officers like Brian are told to
secure the services of at least one informant in every street. Make himself known to local officials, anyone who has legitimate access to private houses and premises and is in a position to give information. Cultivate shopkeepers, tradesmen and garage proprietors were always good sources of information.
Not this morning.
Not so far anyway.
I've never used the phrase an informant in every street, but if there was somebody in every street who was concerned enough to keep an eye out for anything that he believes is wrong or hears is wrong, then I'd be very glad if he would tell us all about it.
I know I have, there were some crime intelligence sheets found on a rubbish dump in Craigmillar in Edinburgh. And the information there includes comments like such and such, a young girl, 16 years old, is stopped in the street. She has got shocking pink hair and is 3 months pregnant. Full stop. End of story. There are other comments.
Did it say she was a criminal or suspected of crime?
No. I analysed these reports and found the number of people who are stopped and checked in enormous, but the hit rate, the arrests that come, are minimal.
You can make what you will of the collection of intelligence and you can make it sound like some horrendous 1984 situation. It is nothing like that. And we are asking everybody, as the Anglo-Saxons did in feudal days, to look after each other, to watch what is happening, asking people, if they can, to provide the police with useful information in the bid to bring down and to reduce the extent of crime.
The people who...
What can possibly be wrong with that as a fundamental human, common community practice? Nothing.
While doing an official study with the police, Richard Kinsey estimated that 60% of those whose police intelligence files he saw had no criminal conviction. These people could include the relations of criminals, innocent witnesses, suspects, even victims of crime. So what sort of information do the association's guidelines suggest that police should keep?
Well, that is a matter for us, isn't it?
What sort of sources should they seek information from, according to the guidelines?
Is this a program about the ACPO or about criminal intelligence? I'm sorry.
It's about the guidelines. The ACPO guidelines. I phrased my question in that way to refer to the guidelines.
How we collect and collate and analyse intelligence is a matter for chief constables. It's not a matter for public discussion.
So ACPO claimed the right to silence. Again. So who does control policing policy in such sensitive matters as intelligence files? Especially now the files are going on to computers. Local intelligence systems have become absolutely standard throughout Britain. ACPO's reports and guidelines, adapted to suit by individual forces, tell police officers what to look for and what to file away. At the national level, a central police computer has been established in Hendon, North London. Because of the usual policing sensitivities, it's called the Police National Computer, not the National Police Computer. The PNC is linked to police headquarters all over Britain, and from there by radio to every police officer on patrol, like PC 3092, Eddie Henderson, on the Newcastle beat.
M12B from Tango 3092.
Tango 3092, go ahead.
A vehicle check, please.
3092, could you go ahead, VRM, please?
It's Charlie 91.
The system means that a vehicle check, to see what the national computer knows about it, can be obtained by members of any police force in Britain. The Police National Computer came into operation 13 years ago and is now used 32 million times a year. Under the guidance of its technical and crime committees, ACPO supervised almost all recent police computer innovations. They found that many major investigations, like the search for the Yorkshire Ripper, got badly bogged down in laborious paperwork. Key pieces of information remained buried in endless filing cabinets full of index cards. In replacing the cabinets with computers, ACPO, not the Home Office, was firmly in the lead. In a series of regular ACPO reviews of the police use of computers, the Home Office's only role is to be thanked for doing the typing. Police special branch officers have to protect senior government ministers when they're in public, but the majority of special branch officers work well away from public view, gathering intelligence and potential threats to public order. That's very political and consequently very sensitive work. But ACPO, not the Home Office, wrote the guidelines specifying special branch duties. 14 years after that, a House of Commons Select Committee decided to look at the special branch. Only then did the Home Office issue their own guidelines, for the very first time. So what happens under this system if ACPO says one thing and the Home Office wants something different? Can the Home Office just say no? We've already seen that in the heat of battle at Orgreave, it was ACPO's guidelines that operated, even though they were different to Home Office policy at the time. Of course, the association doesn't always get its own way over things like cash and staffing and resources. But if the Home Office wanted to impose a policy on Britain's police chiefs that they didn't want,
I feel that if 43 chief constables won't do or don't want to do what the Home Office want them to do, the chief constables will win.
so as a body you are at liberty within the law to go off in your own direction, ignoring what the Home Office says.
Well, when you say ignoring what the Home Office says, I think that's putting it rather strongly. Clearly, we have to do what we believe is right in any given set of circumstances.
If ACPO wished to be opposed to a central government, it would be able to do so up to a very high point, I think. I think you would need a change in the law to alter that.
Now, having reached the giddy heights of ACPO membership, and that means above the rank of Chief Superintendent, how do you make it to the very top of the association itself? Not for this trade union the uncertainties of secret ballots and elections.
In practice, what actually happens is that the policy committee would select who they think should be the next president of ACPO. And you get the situation where at their annual conference this selection is put before the audience and they're invited to accept him.
And it's a matter for the annual general meeting of our association whether or not they are prepared to endorse a year's vice president as the president the following year when the time comes. Invariably that is done.
I can't imagine, for instance, that when they were told that Jim Anderton was going to be the vice president, they were asked, does anybody want to vote against him?
Mr. Anderton was elected this morning as the president of this association by his fellow members without any demur or issue or otherwise.
Does anyone ever say no to the existing hierarchy of ACPO appointing their successors?
Not up to now. And I cannot think of a very good reason why they should.
I have been told that on one occasion in the last decade, when the name of the future president was announced, it was greeted with a roar of, or a groan of disapproval. But nobody actually got up and said they objected to him, and that man went on to become president of ACPO.
The organisation tends to be dominated by the strong personalities and people who take a special interest in the, what do I call, the power structure of ACPO. A number of chief constables are just content to be running their police forces and not to take too much of a leading part in national affairs. So it tends to be a kind of self-selecting hierarchy.
It is self-selecting. There are 5 people who select a friend, somebody in whom they've got confidence, and the rest of the body has no practical say in who that person is.
Who am I to serve? Am I to serve?
At local level, however, chief constables can and do speak their minds to local police authorities. Officially, the chief constable answers to the authority, but it's not always clear who's telling who what to do.
I serve the people who are being beaten, and this committee does too. And don't forget it.
Open war between police authorities and police chiefs isn't unusual these days. Chief constables have a degree of autonomy that can arouse fierce criticism. One such incident provoked the head of the Manchester Police Authority to comment.
We seem to operate on the principle of the infallibility of chief constables.
We consult them, we listen to them, but at the end of the day, someone has got to make a decision and be finally accountable in law. And who better than a chief constable?
If he wants to challenge his police authority, the chances are that he will win both the support of the Home Secretary and, if necessary, as has happened quite recently, he can go to the appeals court and get his police authority overruled. The actual policy of how you police your community will vary from community to community and priority to priority. It may be that the burghers of Bromley are more concerned about burglary than those in Islington who are more concerned about parking on the sidewalks and children being killed in the traffic. And all of these problems are really local problems which have to be handled by the local authority, just like any other.
It's a question of, I mean, we know, for example, that the police can't enforce every law in the book. It's impossible. They make choices. Now, it's important that those choices are in line with what local populations, local communities want.
I think at the present time, nobody quite understands the nature of the power, or the potential power, of ACPO in the political sense. I mean, ACPO hasn't got a constitutional position. It isn't even mentioned in legislation. And perhaps the time has come when it should be.
To have a politically directed police force, even if determined by a democratic process, I personally feel that that would not be in the best public interest. If it was decreed that that is how it should be, then I have no grounds upon which to object. But I think I would then be living in a country that was not my country. And I would have to review my whole position, professionally and personally, very critically indeed. I might have to campaign against such a system.
To you, then, does democracy mean political control?
Are we talking about James Anderton, the Democrat or anti-Democrat, or are we discussing the affairs of the ACPO?
So what are the verdicts on our original charges against ACPO? Not guilty to trying to set up a national police force. Having undue influence on government policy. Well, the evidence is there, but perhaps politicians too should be in the dock for neglecting their duty. And ACPO plead guilty to the charge of being accountable to no one but themselves. The charge of being unnecessarily secretive? Well, you can be the judge of that.
Next.